This is the flat oyster, a native bivalve of the North Sea that shapes its environment by forming reefs. Around 200 years ago, flat oyster reefs covered up to 20% of the North Sea. The area between the Doggerbank and the Dutch coast is still known as the oyster grounds, named after the once abundant oyster beds. But today, only the name remains. From the late 1800s, intensive oyster fishing with steamships began. Later, beam trawling further damaged the oyster beds. Combined with outbreaks of a parasite in the 70s, this has left only a few scattered oyster banks across the region. Recognizing the ecological value of flat oyster reefs, Dutch policymakers are now working to bring them back. But how do you do that? Here, nature may find an unexpected ally, the wind energy industry. Flat oyster recruitment and survival depend on many physical factors such as temperature, salinity, bottom structure, sedimentation, and currents. One of the most important factors for recruitment is the presence of hard substrate, which oyster larvae need to settle on. For decades, stones and shell material were removed from the seafloor to make trawling easier. The North Sea has become a soft-bottom desert. This is where the wind turbines come in. Wind turbines are stabilized on the seafloor by granite rocks, a substrate that appears very suitable for oyster larval settlement. Additionally, fishing vessels and other traffic are restricted in windparks, reducing seabed disturbance. Another very important physical factor in the North Sea is sand waves, large volumes of sand that can move up to 20 meters per year. They can completely bury and suffocate an oyster reef. At the west coast, the sand waves are high and abundant, but above Schiermonnikoog, sand waves are lower and occur less frequently. This explains why oyster reefs could develop here before and why the Gemini windpark, located in this region, is a promising site for flat oyster reef restoration. However, there are also some constraints here. Since almost all flat oysters have disappeared, natural spatfall is absent, making spontaneous return of the flat oyster impossible. It needs to be reintroduced. At other wind farms, they used oyster gauges or tables to avoid them being displaced by currents or buried by sand waves. However, since these forces are limited at the Gemini windpark, the engineers decided to place loose living oysters and shells directly on the granite stones. Some of the oysters were glued together with BESE paste, a calcic material that supports spat settlement on the granite. 2 years later, also baby oysters grown on shells, called spat on shell, were added to further promote reef growth. When oysters are reintroduced, it is important to consider the risk of introducing parasites, diseases, or invasive species. A parasite of particular concern is Bonamia ostrea, which infects the immune cells of oysters. Repeated releases and high oyster densities increase this risk. This can be mitigated by sourcing oyster spat from hatcheries, where oysters are monitored and screened. Using spat from multiple hatcheries can also help ensure genetic diversity. In the case of Gemini, adult oysters were harvested from Norway, a region with a low disease risk, and spat was sourced from a hatchery in Scotland. If reef restoration efforts succeed, the ecological impact could be substantial. Flat oysters are vital ecosystem engineers. They improve water quality by filtering seawater, and their feces contribute to nutrient recycling and enhance benthic-pelagic coupling. When they grow in dense clusters, they form 3D reef structures that stabilize sediments and provide habitat for many species, including cod, stingrays, and dog whelks. In this way, oyster reefs enhance both biodiversity and ecosystem productivity. The favorable conditions at the Gemini windpark offer a unique opportunity to establish the largest and most offshore artificial oyster reef to date. The windpark will operate for at least 25 years. During this time, continued monitoring is essential to track the reef's development and ensure the substrate and introduced oysters support a self-sustaining reef. It should also be assessed whether the reefs will expand into the soft sediment between the wind turbines or whether additional substrate will be required here. Remarkably, there is currently no clear plan for what will happen after the 25 years. Since the ecological value of an oyster reef increases over time, a long-term strategy should be developed to help restore the oyster grounds, so that one day they will once again live up to their name.